everyone, and welcome to a new video. Today's video is going to be a mixture of a vlog and a making style video, and in this video I will be making a skirt and a blouse, or at least that is my plan. I have a bit of a sketch over here, so this is what I have in mind. I'm thinking a collared shirt with short sleeves that has cuffs, then some sort of gored skirt that flows nicely from the waist over the hips. And the fun part about this project is the fabric that I'm going to be using, and you can see a little swatch of it down here. This is part of a new collection at Joann's, and there's vintage simplicity fabrics. So they aren't vintage style fabrics, they are fabrics with vintage looking simplicity ladies on them. So this is artwork from patterns that they've released over the years that has been printed onto material. I think there are about a dozen fabrics in the range, but this one was my absolute favorite, so I decided to buy 4 yards of it, and I was torn between turning it into a skirt and turning it into a blouse. But I thought it'd be a little bit more wearable and a little bit more of a versatile piece within my wardrobe as a blouse, so that is what I'm doing. But I don't just want to make a blouse because that seems a little bit boring. I want to make an outfit, so I'm also going to be using this pink twill to create a skirt to go with it. Since this design isn't particularly unique, I think it will be best executed by following some vintage patterns. It's also been a really long time, like probably 6 months since I followed a vintage pattern, so I just thought that would be a fun thing to do and hopefully a fun thing for you guys to watch me doing. I have a pattern in mind for the skirt, but I haven't rated my pattern stash to see if I have anything really appropriate for the blouse. So that's going to be the first step, and then once I've selected a pattern, I can actually get started on making this ensemble. But before I get too deep into this, I want to mention that this video is sponsored by Skillshare, and I'll be talking about them more in depth later on in the video. So I'm going to sort through these and be on the lookout for that skirt pattern and also any sort of blouse pattern that would be appropriate. I might pull out some of my favorites to show you too. Okay, this is not what I had in mind at all because it's more 1950s than it is 1940s, but that's a really cute skirt pattern and I really love the blouse too. This could be quite fun too. I don't know if I have enough fabric for it, but it's like a shirt with a jumper over top of it. This, believe it or not, is a maternity pattern, which I did not know at the time, but I haven't gotten rid of it yet because I think it's a really cute design for a wrap dress. I'd make this, but I don't think it's very seasonally appropriate, and I also think it would make me look like I'm wearing a diaper. But I didn't let either of those things stop me from purchasing it. So let's see what drawer number 2 has in store for us. So I just spent about 4 minutes looking at these because I'm really attracted to this pattern. I flipped it over to look at the instructions, and it explicitly says that it's a maternity jumper and blouse pattern. So I just did a second pass through my pattern collection and I found a whole bunch of jumper patterns. I like the idea of doing a jumper pattern because then I'm just following one pattern instead of mixing and matching. And I also don't have a lot of jumpers in my wardrobe. So it's been a couple days and I ended up posting a poll on Patreon and had people vote between the 4 jumper patterns that I showed you. And this is the winner. It's a mail order pattern and the envelope says fashion service on it, so I think that's the brand. But this is pattern number 2034 and it's in a size 16, but it's a junior's pattern, so the measurements run a little bit small. It's made to fit a 34-inch bust and 37-inch hips, so I'm gonna have to let it out pretty significantly to get it to fit me, who is not a junior and who has very large hips. So far this morning I've gone through the pattern pieces and I've pulled out the pieces that I need and set aside the others. In preparation for cutting the pattern out, I've also ironed all of the pieces, and I've gotten a lot of questions about this in the past. I just use my iron on whatever heat it's currently set for. I find that pattern pieces tend to be pretty hardy in terms of what heat they'll tolerate. However, my iron is quite sharp and pointy at the tip, so I have an iron shoe on it just to round out the edges so they won't catch on the tissue and accidentally tear it. Once that was done, I just used the pattern pieces that are printed in the instructions and traced them onto tissue paper and marked out all the additions that I'm going to be making to them. I'm not going to be grading this pattern properly because it isn't that small for me. It's also not that complicated. So instead of making major alterations to it, I'm just going to be letting out the side seams and letting out the shoulder seams and making minor adjustments that way. Now this pattern is intended to have 3/8 of an inch seam allowances, which I really don't like. I'm used to working with 1/2 inch seam allowances and that is my preference. So even for the edges that don't need to be let out to provide more room in the garment, I'm going to be adding a 1/4 inch to them just so I can assemble this with 1/2 inch seams since that's what I'm more familiar with. In addition to using 1/2 inch seams, I'm also going to be sewing a lot of this with French seams. So a bunch of edges that I'm not going to be letting out for fit purposes, I'm going to be adding an additional 5/8 of an inch to, and that way I can sew them with a French seam, which requires a total of a 1 inch seam allowance. My fabric is all pre-washed, so I'm just going to get it laid out and start cutting these pieces out. In addition to cutting the pieces out, I will be transferring all of the perforations, which mark various things that you have to do to the garment onto my fabric. So for example, perforations mark the dart placement, the grain line, the center front of the garment, the center back of the garment, and so on. So it's important to transfer all of those markings, which aren't markings, those things that are marked by perforations onto the fabric so you know what you're doing later on. And if you haven't seen any of my other videos, perforations were used to mark the placement for various things before patterns actually began to be printed with ink. And I almost prefer perforated patterns because then you don't have to lift the tissue out of the way to mark the points on darts. You can just mark it through the perforation in the pattern, which is great. I'm going to cut this out first, but I just want you to be prepared for the complaining that is going to follow once I actually start constructing this, because the instructions for this are ridiculous. And I totally jinxed myself because when I posted these various pattern options on Patreon, I wrote out the pros and the cons for each pattern. And for this one, the main con was, and I want to get my exact wording here, mail order patterns usually have instructions written by demons who can barely speak English, but maybe this would make for an entertaining video. And I was not wrong. The instructions for this really don't make any sense, but that is a hurdle we are going to jump over once we get this garment cut out and can begin on actual construction. So let's do that. So I'm on day 5 of attempting to start on this project. This video really has not been going well. In fact, none of my videos have been going well, but I'll rant about that later too. So yesterday I was going to get the jumper cut out, and when I laid the fabric out, the pink material I was planning on using, I realized I didn't have enough of it, and like nowhere near enough of it. So I ended up having this fabric in my stash, which is a linen, and it's kind of similar in color to the other fabric I was using, but I don't think the weight of this is very good for the jumper. The other fabric I had in my stash that I thought might work would be this corduroy. Basically committed to going ahead with this, and then I realized that the blouse fabric would look amazing with the denim because it has so much blue in it. But I didn't have any denim in my stash. So I ended up taking a trip to Joann's, which is like half an hour away. So I spent over an hour driving just to get this denim, but now I have the denim. I have enough of it, I hope. I think this is going to be really great for this project. I'm really excited to finally get started on it. So I'm going to get this laid out. I'm going to get my jumper pieces laid out. I'm going to make the alterations to the pattern, letting it out in the way that I mentioned earlier. And then I will finally be able to finish cutting this out, which is like step 1 of 50 in actually getting this project done, but it's a step in the right direction. Oh, and then last night I broke my buttonhole foot. So now I have to wait for that to arrive from Amazon before I can even finish this project because I don't have anything to sew the buttonholes with. I swear this project is cursed, and everything I've been working on recently has been cursed. I've been filming so much recently because my new camera setup is so great. Like, I really love it. It makes filming so much easier. I have a camera permanently set up over my sewing machine and permanently set up over my iron. And then I have one camera that floats around and generally takes footage of the actual sewing process. So it's so much easier to film stuff now because I'm not constantly moving cameras around. Whereas before, whenever I filmed a project, it would really increase the time it took to finish that project because there was so much setup for the camera involved. So now it's like second nature to film a project, which is fantastic. And I've been filming all the time. Like, it is January 20th, and I think I've attempted to film 5 videos this month. Not that you can tell by what I've posted, because none of those videos have ended up working out. I filmed the making of a petticoat. The petticoat ended up being too big, so I had to remake it. I filmed the making of a bum pad. I ended up having issues with the construction, so I don't think I'm going to post that. I think I'm going to remake it. I filmed making a pouch for my boning storage, which actually turned out pretty well, but I don't think anyone would really be interested in that. I filmed making of an elliptical hoop skirt that turned out horribly, so now I have to redo that. Then I made a petticoat to go over top of the elliptical hoop skirt, which actually turned out pretty well, but I have to fix the elliptical hoop skirt before I can post about that. I'm trying to make a corset out of a sequin fabric, which is just as much of a disaster as you would expect. And it feels like everything I touch just goes to crap, and I feel like this project is no exception, which is highly unfortunate because this is a sponsored video, so I actually have a deadline that this needs to be posted by. So let's really hope that this project turns around, it goes fantastically well, and I can get this video out to all of you. Because I'm feeling quite discouraged right now. The fabric I was originally trying to use was 42 inches wide, and this is 60 inches wide, so the panels actually fit on it much better, and I even have enough room left over to let the panels out like I'd intended, which is awesome. So now everything is cut out. I'm just using a Sharpie because I know it won't bleed through the denim to mark all of the perforations onto the jumper pieces. And then for the blouse, I'm just using a pencil to mark all of the darts and perforations and such onto the blouse pieces. And all of these markings are going to be on the wrong side of the fabric because obviously you don't want them to be visible when the garment is worn. All perforations are not created equally. Some of them just mark grain line, and those don't have to be transferred. There are also some that mark the hem placement. I'm not going to transfer those either. I'm just going to measure away from the bottom edge of the garment once it is further along in its completion stage. However, the ones that mark the center front and the darts are pretty important, so I'm transferring all of those. And I'm also making sure to clip all of the notches because those are going to be important later on as well. I find notches are extra important when the patterns aren't printed because sometimes that's all you have to go on what goes together and how things are sewn together. And after that is done, it is time to pull out the instructions. So now that everything is cut out and marked and notched, I can actually begin following the instructions. So instruction number 1 is make inside darts in jumper front and back, also in blouse front and top of sleeves, sewing corresponding small perforations together, ending sewing in a point at small perforation. So basically I'm just pinning all the darts, sewing all the darts, and ironing all the darts. And my preferred way of doing darts is folding the material at what I think is the center of the dart, and then making sure that my pin is going through the pencil line on one side of the fabric. I'm also ensuring that it's going through the pencil line on the back of the fabric too. That was a bad example, but I think you get the idea of what I mean. So I'm just going to do that for all of the darts, and then I can go ahead and sew them. And since this fabric isn't super thin or delicate, I'm going to go ahead and backstitch at the end of the darts. Some people like to leave their threads long and then actually knot the threads together by hand and clip the excess, and that gives you a nicer finish on the darts, but I don't find it's particularly necessary unless you're working with something like tulle or chiffon or even some silks, which will really show kind of the bulk of the back stitching at the end of a dart. But with this, as I said, don't think it's particularly necessary, so I'm just going to get these pinned and sewn as you would expect. And there are 4 darts in the tops of each sleeve. There is a dart at the shoulder of the front panels of the bodice, as well as a dart at the bust that extends outward from the side seam. Then there are darts in the front and the back of the jumper. So lots to pin and sew here. Alright, so I've gone ahead and sewn all the darts, and then I pressed all the darts so they are facing the directions shown in the diagrams on the pattern. So now I can set aside all the pieces for the blouse, and we're going to focus on the jumper because that is what the next 2 instructions address. For step 2, it says turn under front edges of jumper along large perforations for hem. I actually ended up marking these perforations on the front of the jumper using chalk. So I can just fold the jumper on that chalk line and then fold that portion inward. And I actually added an additional 1/2 inch to this edge. So what I'm going to do is turn this edge inward and then whip stitch that down, and that's going to give me a cleaner finish. They don't talk at all about finishing the edges in this pattern, so that's why I opted to add allowances so I could do it myself. But if you didn't want to add extra allowance to a pattern like this, you could just bind this edge. This is actually the selvage of the fabric, so I could have just left it as is. It won't fray, but I don't think the selvage looks particularly nice on denim, so that's why I'm turning it inward. And then I'm just going to either whip stitch or cross stitch this folded edge down. They don't tell you how to secure this in the pattern, but they do show something that resembles slip stitches, securing it in the diagram, so that's what I'm going to go ahead and do. So it is me from the future jumping in, because this is kind of where the vlog footage ends. There are a few other little snippets you'll see throughout the video, but for the most part I wasn't in a very good mood the day I was working on this, and it was really hard for me to continue talking to the camera while I was working on it. So I decided I would film the rest of this more like a making of style video. So I filmed every step of the process, and I'll be narrating over top of it. Now before I break down each step that I went through when constructing this, I thought I would read you their instructions, or specifically the instructions that are kind of relevant to the part I'm working on. So we're currently focusing on instruction number 2, which corresponds with diagram number 2. So we already completed the first part of this, which was turn under front edges of jumper along large perforations for hem. It also says join seams as notched, turn hem at lower edge along small perforations, underface neck edge and armhole edges with a bias facing of material. Lap right front jumper over left front matching triple small perforations that indicate the center front. Finish to close. And I'll insert a photo of the diagram here, so you can clearly see in this diagram the facing they mentioned, the darts, the seams, the hem, and everything like that. So this does give us enough information to construct it, so that is what I'm going to go ahead and do. They said join seams as notched, and I opted to start with the shoulder seams. So I'm pinning the jumper pieces together with the wrong sides facing each other. These seams were sewn with a 1/2 inch allowance. Then the seam allowance was trimmed, the seam was ironed flat, then the jumper pieces were folded on the seam line with the right sides facing each other, and pinned once again. This was also sewn with a 1/2 inch allowance and ironed once more, and this makes for a tidy French seam where all the raw edges are tucked away. Now, according to their instructions, I had more seams to sew, but I decided to underface the neck edges first. This is done with a bias facing. They don't give exact dimensions for the facing, so I cut my bias strips to be 1.5 inches wide. The strips were all cut out, then sewn together, so I had one very long strip instead of a dozen or so smaller strips. This strip will be used to bind the neck edge, the arm openings, and the hem of the jumper. I'm pressing all the seams that join the strips together to get it as flat and smooth as possible. Then I'm pressing one edge inward by approximately 1/2 inch. You could measure this, but it's not that important, so I didn't bother. Now the bias strips can be pinned around the neck edge of the jumper with the right sides facing each other and the raw edges even. I sewed these strips on with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I trimmed the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch, then ironed the strip, which they refer to as bias facing, so it sits flat over top of the seam allowance. Now I'm going to understitch this facing. This is not mentioned in the instructions, but really helps to encourage the material to turn inward and leads to a smoother finish. So I'm going to do it anyway. This is just done by stitching over top of the strip and the seam allowance as close to the point where the pieces are seamed together as possible. It should naturally want to turn inward at the stitch point, but I'm using an iron to help ease the process. Then I'm pinning the facing in place. They don't specify how to secure the bias underfacing, but the pattern diagram makes it look like it's hand sewn, so I opted to stitch it in place with whip stitches. Now I'm going back to their first instruction and seaming the pieces together as the notches suggest, starting with the side seams. And once again, I'm sewing these with French seams, first with the wrong sides facing each other, then they are trimmed, then they are ironed, then they're repinned, sewn again, ironed again, etc. Now the bias strips, or bias facing pieces, whatever you want to call them, are coming back out and getting pinned around the arm openings, once again with the right sides facing each other and the raw edges even. Like with the facing around the neckline, this was stitched on with a 1/2 inch allowance, then the allowance was trimmed down, understitched, and folded inward. The process of turning this facing inward without creating puckers is a bit more challenging since the edges of the arm opening are quite curved, but if you take your time and use lots of pins, it's very doable. And once it's pinned, I'm whip stitching the folded edge of the facing down. Now the last seam for the jumper is sewn, which is the back seam, and this was, you guessed it, sewn as a French seam. French seams aren't ideal for thicker fabrics like denim since they can be quite bulky, but I prefer it to having frayed edges, and this particular denim is quite thin, so it worked out just fine. I tried the jumper on and decided a 2-inch hem would be flattering, so I'm using chalk and a ruler to mark a line 2 inches away from the bottom edge of the garment on the right side of the fabric. I sewed the remaining bias facing strip onto the hem. I trimmed the seam allowance down and ironed the facing flat, but I did not understitch it because I'm not turning it inward on that edge. I'm just using it to finish the edge. The hem is actually turned inward at the chalk line I made a moment ago. Except it can't really be turned inward, at least not properly, though you can see me doing my best in this footage. The jumper pieces are cut so they flare out towards the hem, making the hem circumference bigger towards the bottom of the skirt. But when the bottom edge of the skirt is turned inward by 2 inches, the hem is actually larger than the portion I'm attempting to pin it to. So I had to ease the bottom edge of the hem to get it to sit flat when turned up by 2 inches. So after roughly pinning it in place, I'm loosely gathering the edge of the hem until it sits flat against the outer layer of fabric. Once it's gathered to fit, I can pin it properly in preparation for actual hemming. And speaking of properly hemming, again they do not specify any method for this, but the diagram shows hand sewing, so hand sewing it was. And as no surprise to anyone, I sewed the hem in place with whip stitches. Then all that was left was finishing to close. Buttonholes were on hold due to the incident involving my buttonhole foot, but I did manage to sew the buttons on. So at this point, my garment was looking pretty similar to the diagram. Maybe not exactly like the diagram, but I'd accomplished pretty much everything that was covered by the diagram, as well as by step or instruction number 2. The only thing we hadn't quite accomplished was the finish to close step because my buttonhole foot hadn't arrived yet, so I wasn't able to sew those until the very end. But other than that, it was finished. Or so I thought. It seemed pretty finished, but the instructions get a little bit murky here. So, picking up from where we left off, it says, instead of making darts and jumper, that's how it begins. There is no, here is another garment you could possibly make with these instructions. It simply says, instead of making darts, in jumper front and back, omit the darts. Make the darts at the armhole edges of jumper front only. Instead, make a bound opening in right front at the dart opening at the waistline for left slash to pass through. Close the center back seam, matching triple notches. Join shoulder and underarm seams as notched. Underface neck edges and armhole with bias facing of material. Cut 2 strips of material for tie sash 46 inches long by 4 3/4 of an inch wide. Finish along edges and one end with a rolled hem. Fold with long edges even. Press. Sew folded end of one sash to front edges of front, the upper creased edge of sash at top. Lap right front over left front, matching at the triple small perforations that indicate the center front. Finish to close. Insert left sash through bound opening at right front, tie ends in a bow at the back. And then step 4 just indicates how to construct the pocket, which I didn't end up adding because it's kind of weirdly positioned. So basically, these instructions take you through a completely different method of constructing this garment, which deem all of the instructions and the previous 2 diagrams completely useless. This really is an entirely different way of assembling the garment. In the diagram that corresponds with this step, they label it as being an apron. So I think this pattern happens to include 2 different sets of instructions that can make the garment in 2 different ways to have it function as 2 different things. things. I've looked over these instructions so many times, and I will link a photo down below so you can see them for yourself, and nowhere do they mention another view or anything that would indicate that this dress can be constructed differently to have a different end result. It is just in these instructions where they magically skip to instead of making darts, and then they tell you how to make a different garment. It's very weird. I've looked it over so many times. I had my mother look it over. I've asked a couple other people, and they're all just as confused as I am. So I'm pretty sure I'm not just being stupid here, but if you want to look over the instructions for yourself, as I said, they will be linked down below. But for now, I'm just gonna move my merry way along and get started on the blouse. So the next set of instructions, which concerns the blouse, and thankfully they only have one set of instructions for this garment, is make darts in blouse front and top of sleeves the same as jumper. So we actually already did this since this was instruction number 1. And then it says, turn front edges of blouse over on large perforations to form front facings and press. Stitch neck edges from front edge to triple small perforation, center front. Turn right side out, base neck edge as notched. Join seams as notched, ease slight fullness across back shoulders to fit front, turning narrow hem at lower edge. Now I didn't quite follow their instructions here. I much prefer attaching the collar to a garment when it can be laid flat, so immediately after sewing at the shoulder seams and before you sew up the side seams. So I'm also going to read you step number 6, which is cut collar, double, seam outside edges, turn, press. So one edge to the inside neck edge as notched, slip stitch other edge over seam. Lap right front blouse over left front, matching triple small perforations, center front, finish to close. So let's get on to all of that. Much like with the jumper, I added an extra ½ inch to the frontmost edges. So I started by folding those edges inward by ½ inch and ironing them. Then, as they requested, I'm folding the fabric of the front piece on the large perforations with the wrong sides facing each other and pressing the uppermost portion. And I used the vertical block print of this fabric's pattern to my advantage to make sure it was turned inward evenly. Now I'm making a mark 1 inch away from the folded edge and pinning the layers together up until that point. I'm sewing it from that point to the folded edge of what will be the front edge of the bodice. Then I'm clipping the excess material away and also clipping vertically into the seam allowance just past where the stitching ends. Then I turned the fabric right side out. What is now the front edge of the bodice can be ironed. At this point, I decided to turn the top edge of the bodice facing inward by ½ inch as well, since I thought it would need to be turned inward prior to finishing the collar, and that it would be easier to do that when the piece was flat. Now moving on to the process of sewing the seams as notched, I'm pinning the shoulder seams, and these were sewn as French seams. As I said earlier, I find it much easier to install a collar prior to sewing up the side seams. So I'll be jumping ahead a step, starting by pinning the collar pieces together with the right sides facing each other. Starting a ½ inch away from the bottom edge of the collar, I'm stitching across the side and outer edges of the collar with a ½ inch seam allowance, and I'm ending my stitching a ½ inch away from the bottom edge as well. Here you can see where the stitching starts, or stops, depending on how you look at it. I did this because I find it makes it easier to sew the collar on later on. Now I'm clipping excess material from the corner of the collar and turning it right side out with the help of a turning tool and a pin. Once the points are adequately pointy, I'm putting a drop of fray check on each one to prevent any threads that might try to escape. To press the collar, I'm using a tailor's board, which is a wooden ironing tool with a lot of different curved and pointed edges. The collar can be positioned on and ironed in a way you can't duplicate on a flat surface. And I got my tailor's board from eBay. It's by the brand June Tailor. Then I'm ironing the collar so the edges are even, and it's ready to be attached to the bodice. Since the bottom ½ inch of the seam securing the collar pieces together was left free, it's easy to fold one side of the collar back and really get it positioned properly around the neckline, which is the next step. I pin the collar on with the wrong sides facing each other and ends the collar even with the finished portion of the neckline. I also made sure the notches matched up. And in case it's not clear, only one layer of the collar is getting sewn on at this point. Speaking of sewing, it was stitched on with a ½ inch allowance. I pressed the seam over a tailor's ham until it was nice and smooth. I also folded the remaining unsewn raw edge of the collar inward by a ½ inch. Oh, and yeah, oops, I might have made a mistake. So I just made a pretty major mistake. I got the collar sewn on, as you saw, and then the bottom edge of the outer portion of the collar is folded inward by a ½ inch. Now there are a couple different ways of sewing a collar, and one of them is where you stitch the collar on with the right sides facing each other, and then you fold the seam allowance on the inner edge inward and whip stitch it down, which is how I thought this was being done. And in that case, this little portion, the facing for the front, would be folded inward and then stitched down to help cover the raw edge of the collar on the interior of the garment. And that's why I ironed ironed this edge inward by a 1/2 inch before I sewed on the collar, because I thought it was going to lap over the raw edges of the collar to finish that edge. But with this one, you're sewing the collar the other way around. So this is the edge that gets whip stitched down to cover the seam allowance, and this piece is supposed to be included when you stitch the collar on, so when the collar flips outward, it's nicely finished on the interior, forming a neat join point where the collar meets the lapel. So this means that I have to iron this portion flat, and then I have to rip off this portion of the seam, and then I have to tuck this underneath and then resew it. So it's kind of a pain, but I'm also glad I caught it at this point instead of after I'd sewed this edge down, because then I would have hand sewing to rip out as well as machine sewing. But this is just a little bump in the road. I'm gonna get it fixed up, and then I'm gonna get this blouse finished. Here's some super speeded up footage of the ripping out and pressing process. I didn't film resewing this, but it looked a lot like the first time I sewed it. Now that outer edge of the collar that was ironed inward can be pinned to cover the raw edges around the neckline of the blouse. I'm also taking this time to pin the edges of the bodice facing in place. They don't mention tacking or sewing these down in the instructions, but I hate flappy facings, so I'm pinning them in preparation for sewing them. I sewed down the edge of the collar first using slip stitches as the instructions instructed, and these are pretty much invisible from the exterior of the garment. I also whip stitched down the facings on both sides of the bodice. Since I have so much footage of this step, I thought it would be a good time to mention today's sponsor, which is Skillshare. I've worked with them before, and I'm thrilled to be working with them again at the start of this new year. Skillshare is an online learning community that offers membership with meetings. There are many things to explore, projects to create, and a supportive community of other creative people. They empower and encourage you to improve at whatever interests you most. Skillshare offers classes designed for your daily life and interests so you can learn and grow in a way that fits any schedule. They offer classes on everything from improving your drawing ability to photography, videography, editing, business, and even management skills. As I've said a few times now, I've been working on improving my filming setup, and I'm trying to improve my filming abilities too. They have classes that have given me a better understanding of the cameras I own and how I can use them to create better content. It's a new year, so why not make 2020 a year where you explore new skills and dive deeper into existing passions? And you can do it for the price of $10 a month with an annual subscription, way more affordable than in-person classes and workshops. Click the link in the description to get 2 free months of premium membership and explore your creativity. Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to the sewing. Now I'm sewing the side seams up with French seams. It's now time for the narrow hem they mentioned, so I'm using my iron to turn the bottom edge of the shirt inward by 1/4 inch or so. Then by hand I'm turning the bottom edge inward again by 1/3 of an inch or so and pinning it down. Once again, no hemming method is mentioned, but the diagram indicates it was done by hand, so by hand it was done. And now we can work on sleeves, which are usually my least favorite part of projects, but I actually really like how they constructed theirs. So sleeves are mentioned in step 7 and step 8 and step 9, but we only need to talk about step 7 and 9 because step 8 has to do with the long sleeve version, which my patrons did not pick, so I did not have to worry about, which I was very happy about because that means that I didn't have to be fussed with the cuff and the closures that correspond with a cuff. So step number 7 is close seam of short sleeve as notched. Turn hem on small perforation. Let's get to that. The sleeve seams, like every other seam on this project, were sewn as French seams. I turned the bottom edge of the sleeves up following the horizontal print of the fabric pattern, also known as approximately a 1/2 inch. Then I'm marking a line 2 inches away from the bottom edge of the sleeve, all the way around the sleeve. The hem is turned up to meet this line and pinned in place, forming an even 1/2 inch hem. Like all the other hems, this guy was sewn down by hand. And I'm back once again. So our sleeves are now done and ready to be attached to the bodice, which is good because that is what the next step concerns. So they say, so either length sleeve in armhole as notched, bring large perforation to shoulder seam, easing slight fullness. So let's do that, and then I think we'll be done. I turned the bodice inside out, then began pinning the sleeve in place with the right sides facing each other. I made sure the notches were aligned, then eased the fabric between these notches to sit smoothly in the arm side. There was actually excess material at the underside of the sleeve, but the cap fit perfectly. So if I were to follow this pattern again, I'd probably add only 3/4 inch of additional fabric to the sleeves, as opposed to the 1 inch I added this time around. I sewed the sleeves on with a 1/2 inch allowance, very slowly, since I had a lot of pins to remove as I sewed. To prevent this edge from fraying, since, alas, sleeves can't be sewn on with French seams, I used some lace binding, top stitched to one side of the seam allowance, then wrapped over the seam allowance and stitched to the other side so all the raw edges are encased. I also pressed this seam after sewing it using a tailor's ham to mimic the shape of a shoulder so it was easier to iron. Buttons were sewn on, and for the top button I was very careful only to sew through the outer layer of fabric so the thread securing it wouldn't be visible when the top button was open and the lapel was revealed. So look at how cute the blouse has turned out. I'm absolutely in love with it. Also, it was totally unintentional, but there ends up being the same lady mirrored on both sides of the lapel, which I think is a really nice touch. When I was cutting this out, I was very conscious of the grain line, and I wanted the stripes of the block print to match up relatively well, but I wasn't paying attention to the actual print and the actual ladies that would match up, so I just think that's a neat little detail. So that is the blouse, and then over here I have the jumper, which is being displayed far less nicely, and all that's left to do is sew the buttonholes, and then I also have to iron the hem on this one because I forgot to do that earlier. Even though buttonholes were mentioned, or actually I don't think they were mentioned in this pattern at all, but even though buttonholes should have been accomplished at an earlier stage in constructing this garment, I haven't been able to do that because my buttonhole foot broke before I started on this piece. This is my old buttonhole foot. It no longer moves the way it's supposed to, and there's no tension on this portion, whereas on this one it snaps back, and that's what you want to have happen. But that doesn't happen with this one anymore because this piece cracked off, and then this little spring wire thing fell off as well. So this is complete and total garbage. I don't think it can even be salvaged with super glue, but I ordered another one that looked similar on Amazon and said it would work with my machine, so let's hope that it does. I'm going to try hooking it in place and doing a couple test buttonholes before I actually sew them on my garments. Also, while I was on Amazon looking at sewing machine feet, I finally bit the bullet and purchased a ruffler foot, so I need to give that a try at some point too. In fact, it kind of looks like a bird with its mouth gaping open, crying out in pain, and that's also sort of how I think I will feel when attempting to learn how to do this, so that'll be fun. But that is for another day. Today we are focusing on buttonholes. When it comes to the actual buttonholes, I'm going to stitch them twice, so they're a little bit denser, and that's going to prevent the fabric from fraying. Then I'm going to cut the buttonholes open, and then I'm going to fray check around the buttonholes just to make sure that none of the threads escape at any point in the future. Also, I'm not sure if I mentioned the process of marking the buttonhole placement. This is the first pattern I've ever followed, I think, that doesn't show the placement of the buttons and the buttonholes. So I ended up kind of making that up, and I just did that by lapping V pieces so the center fronts were lined, and then I just marked where I wanted approximately my buttons to be, and then I marked approximately where the matching buttonholes would go, and I used a ruler to make sure that all the lines were straight and they were evenly spaced, and that's what I'm going with. I don't know if it's the positioning that the pattern intended, but they didn't give me that information, so I had to make it up myself. Also for buttons, I'm using relatively thick plastic red buttons that I purchased at Joann's. I actually ordered a dozen some odd of these online, and I purchased buttons specifically for this project in store, but they were a little bit too large to work on the blouse, and I didn't quite have enough of them, so I decided to use these smaller ones instead, but I really like that they suit both the blouse and the jumper, so they have matching buttons. I think it's a cute little detail. Thankfully, my buttonhole foot ended up working, so now all of those are sewn, and I'm quite excited to show you what I have ended up with and what the finished garments look like. So this is it. I love the color of it so much and how it looks with the red buttons. I'm so glad that I went out and purchased the denim because I really think it's the perfect pairing for this blouse. I especially can't wait to wear this blouse with like denim skirts and jeans in the summer. I think that's going to be so cute, but I think this in its current iteration is quite cute as well. So I'm going to go outside and take some more photos of this, and I guess I should put on some makeup before I do that, and I'm really not looking forward to it because it is currently the middle of winter. It's about 20 degrees Fahrenheit out, which is really quite cold, or at least quite cold to be wearing short sleeves and a denim jumper, but I'm going to put myself through that and hopefully have some photos of how this looks worn, and then I will wrap this video up with my thoughts on this project. So I have now finished this project. I have worn the finished project, I've photographed the finished project, and I've edited the photos of the finished project. So I've had some time to formulate my thoughts on it, and I thought a good way to finish this video off would be by sharing those thoughts with all of you. So my feelings on this project are a little bit mixed, but mostly positive, or at least for the blouse, they're mostly positive. I think the blouse is adorable. I'm really happy with how it fits. I love the way it was constructed with darts in the sleeve. I'm also pleasantly surprised with how the blouse fits through the bust. I don't think I mentioned it, but it has some aggressive darts in it, especially the one that comes down from the shoulder. I was worried it was going to be made for someone with a much larger bust than me, and it might be kind of awkward in the way it sits on me. But I'm really happy with how it fits. I'm also really happy with how easy it was to put together. Things lined up nicely, and though the instructions were vague, I didn't have any problems during the construction process. I'd feel comfortable and confident following this blouse pattern again if I had another material that I wanted to turn into a blouse that I could add to my wardrobe. As for the jumper, I'm less happy with this garment. Don't get me wrong, I think it looks super cute in the pictures. It just doesn't fit me quite right, and I also don't feel like it's the most flattering on me. It doesn't have a really defined waistline, and I tend to favor things that cinch me in a little bit at the waist. And since this is drafted without a waist seam, I don't feel like I quite get that definition. I also don't think the fit through the bust is the best, and I will show you what I mean. If I stand with my shoulders back, it looks absolutely fine, but when I walk for a while or if I slouch at all, this is what ends up happening. It gapes away from my bust pretty significantly, and this isn't an easy enough change of just taking in the straps and then getting the fit I want. What I'd actually have to do is slash the pattern here and take out probably 2 or 3 inches of material here, then taper that off. So basically, if I were to alter the garment after constructing it to try and improve the fit, I'd have to add darts here, but this is a fit change that I could make to the pattern before cutting it out without having to add an additional dart there. I can't really hold this against the pattern. They're drafted to fit what's standard, and if you're outside what is standard, you're going to have to make alterations to make that pattern fit you better. In hindsight, I should have made a mock-up, regret not making a mock-up, but I also don't know this thing that I would have caught in a mock-up because I don't think it would have been nearly as much of a problem with a lighter weight fabric. So on that note, thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed, giving this video a like and a comment would really help me out. And if you would like to see more of my videos, then you can always subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. And I will talk to all of you very soon. And hopefully when I say very soon, I mean like in the next week. We won't have another month-long gap in between uploads. But it kind of depends on how kind the filming gods are to me, because they've not been especially nice recently. Do you have any thoughts on this project, Guinevere? How do you feel about jumpers made out of vintage Simplicity lady fabric? Do you think I should have used the corduroy? Gwen is really not a very helpful assistant, but she's the only assistant I have, and she's very, very cute, so I put up with it. I really hope you enjoyed our video, and we're now going to celebrate finishing this by eating some ice cream.